Clara Whitmore burned the letter at dawn. Her hands didn't shake. That surprised her. She had read it only once, her mother's handwriting sharp and deliberate. Mr. Caldwell arrives Friday. You will stay out of sight. Isabella must have every advantage. Her own mother. Her own blood. Clara fed the paper to the candle flame and watched it curl into nothing. Then she picked up the account ledger, pressed her ink-stained fingers against the cover, and went back to work. Because someone had to save this family. Even if that someone would never be thanked for it. If this story already has you feeling something, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now sit back, because this one is going to take everything you've got. The summer of 1816 came to Harrow County, Virginia, like a man who had already made up his mind. Hot. Certain. Unyielding. The kind of summer that dried creek beds and cracked the red clay roads into something that looked like broken skin. The kind that made horses restless before noon and made women fan themselves on porches while pretending the heat wasn't killing them. Clara Whitmore was not on the porch. She was in the barn. She had been there since 4 in the morning, before the sun came up, before the roosters decided to make themselves useful, before her mother's voice could find her and assign her somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. She was going over the ledgers by lantern light, when she heard Thomas, the youngest of the 3 remaining farmhands, come running through the barn door with his boots only half laced. "Miss Clara?" He was breathing hard. "Miss Clara, your mama's calling everyone to the house." Clara didn't look up from the page. "Tell her I'll be there when I finish this column." "She said now, miss." "And I said when I finish the column, Thomas." He shifted from foot to foot. Poor boy. He was only 17 and had learned very quickly that the Whitmore household operated according to 2 entirely different sets of rules, one for Mrs. Whitmore and Isabella, and one for Clara, and that trying to carry messages between those 2 worlds was the most dangerous work on the property. "She said Mr. Caldwell's coming Friday," Thomas offered, like that information might change something. It didn't. Clara already knew. She had known for 3 weeks, ever since the letter arrived from Nathaniel Caldwell's solicitor, formal, precise, almost surgical in its politeness, requesting an introduction to the Whitmore family at their earliest convenience. She had been the one to open it. She had been the one to read it to her mother, who had immediately burst into tears of relief and called for smelling salts. She had been the one to write back and confirm the date. And then her mother had sat down at the writing desk and composed a second letter, the one Clara had burned this morning, explaining in careful, elegant language that Clara herself should not be present during Mr. Caldwell's first visit, because her presence might complicate things. Clara closed the ledger. She set it on top of the grain barrel she used as a desk, picked up the lantern, and walked out of the barn into the early morning dark. The Whitmore estate was beautiful in the way that ruins are beautiful from a distance in the right light before you got close enough to see the rot. The main house still had its columns, still had its wide porch and its long gravel drive and the magnolia trees her grandmother had planted 50 years ago. Now so large they cast the whole east lawn into deep afternoon shade. From the road it looked like money. It looked like permanence. Up close you could see the missing shutters on the second floor. You could see where the porch boards had been replaced with wood that didn't quite match. You could see that the garden, which should have had 3 gardeners this time of year, had only one old Mr. Pace, who was 72 and moved like every step cost him something. Clara saw all of it. She had been seeing it for 4 years, ever since her father died, and left behind a mountain of debts that nobody in the family had known about or had pretended not to know about. And she had sat down at his writing desk the week after the funeral and started going through every paper, every contract, every promissory note, because someone had to. That was the moment she understood what she was in this family. Not a daughter. Not a woman to be cherished or presented or worried over. She was the one who stayed behind when everyone else looked away. Her mother was waiting in the parlor. Margaret Whitmore was a handsome woman of 53 who wore her disappointments the way other women wore jewelry, visibly, deliberately, and with the clear expectation that everyone around her would acknowledge them. She was sitting in the good chair, the one they only brought out when company was expected, wearing her second-best morning dress and an expression that said she had been awake since before Clara, and intended for that sacrifice to be noted. Isabella was beside her on the settee. And this was the difference between the two sisters laid out so plainly it almost hurt to look at. Isabella Whitmore, at 21, was the kind of beautiful that made strangers stop talking mid-sentence. Dark gold hair that curled softly at her temples. A face that painters would have argued over. Hands that had never been stained with ink or chapped from cold water, because Clara had made very sure of that, had made very sure that whatever broke down in this household, it was never going to show on Isabella's face or hands, or the particular quality of light in her eyes, because Isabella was the plan. Isabella had always been the plan. Clara understood that. She had understood it since she was 15, and Margaret had sat her down with the particular gentleness of a woman preparing to deliver information. She knows will land hard and said, "You must understand, my darling, that you have a different kind of value than your sister." A different kind of value. Clara had spent 10 years figuring out what that meant. Now she stood in the parlor doorway, still wearing her barnwork clothes, her hair pinned back with 2 pencils, because she'd lost her hairpins somewhere in the account records, and looked at her mother's expression and knew exactly what was coming. Clara. Margaret's voice was the voice she used when she was trying to be reasonable and finding it difficult. "We need to talk about Friday." "I know about Friday." "Then you know I need you to stay out of sight." Clara walked into the room and sat down in the chair across from them. Not the good chair. The other one, the one with the leg that wobbled. "I read the letter, Mama. I've already arranged to be with the Harmon accounts on Friday. You won't need to worry about me." Something moved across Margaret's face. It wasn't quite guilt. It was the expression of a woman who had prepared herself for a fight, and found the opponent had already surrendered, which was somehow both a relief and an irritation. "You're not angry?" Isabella asked. She was looking at Clara with those clear blue eyes that always looked like she was asking a more complicated question than the one she was actually saying. "Why would I be angry?" Clara said. "Because Mama is asking you to. Mama is asking me to do what makes sense." Clara looked at her mother. "Mr. Caldwell is coming to meet a bride. Isabella is the bride. There's no reason for me to be present, and several reasons for me not to be. It's a practical decision." Margaret relaxed visibly. "Exactly. You've always been the practical one." "Yes," Clara said. "I have." She stood up, picked up the ledger she'd carried in from the barn, and looked at her mother. "I've been going through last quarter's accounts. We're behind on the mill payment by $60. I need to know if you want me to approach Mr. Harmon about an extension, or if you'd prefer I find another solution." Margaret waved her hand. "After Friday, that won't be an issue. After Friday, Mr. Caldwell will have met Isabella. He won't have married her. The mill payment is due in 2 weeks. Clara. $60, Mama. I need to know what you want me to do." A silence settled over the parlor, like a held breath. Then Margaret said, "Do whatever you think is best." She always said that. Clara had noticed she said it most often when she wanted to believe that whatever went wrong next was someone else's fault. "All right," Clara said. "I'll handle it." She walked back to the barn. Friday came the way things always came in that summer of 1816, without mercy and without warning. Clara had arranged to be at the Harmon property by 9 in the morning. She had dressed in her second-best dress, which was not very good, pinned her hair with actual pins this time, and was carrying the account books under one arm when she heard the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. She stopped. She was standing at the corner of the house, just at the edge of where the magnolia shadows fell across the path, and she wasn't supposed to be there. She was supposed to have left 20 minutes ago. She would have if the draft horse hadn't thrown a shoe that morning and required 45 minutes of her attention before Thomas could ride him to the blacksmith. So she was there. She was standing in the magnolia shadow with account books under her arm and ink on her second finger and her mother's voice in her head saying, "Stay out of sight." And she watched Nathaniel Caldwell step down from his carriage. She didn't know what she had expected. She knew his reputation, of course. Everyone in Harrow County knew Nathaniel Caldwell. 34 years old. owned more land than any other man in the county, served as magistrate, was said to be serious, just difficult to impress, and not particularly interested in social performance of any kind. She had pictured someone older somehow. Someone who looked like authority, felt heavy and deliberate, and a little gray at the temples. Nathaniel Caldwell was tall. Dark hair. He moved like a man who was used to covering ground efficiently and had no patience for spectacle. He was wearing good clothes, but had the look of someone who found them mildly inconvenient. He stepped down, said something to his driver, and turned toward the house. And then, for a reason Clara would spend a long time afterward trying to explain to herself, he paused. He didn't look at the house. He looked at the magnolia trees. And then he looked directly at Clara. She didn't move. She didn't think fast enough to move. She just stood there in the shadow with her account books and her ink-stained finger and her not very good dress, looking back at him, and for approximately 4 seconds, that felt considerably longer. Nathaniel Caldwell looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then her mother's voice came floating down from the porch, bright and practiced and full of welcome, and his attention moved away, and Clara walked around the back of the house and kept going until she was on the road to the Harmon property. She didn't let herself think about it. She was very good at not letting herself think about things. She was gone for 6 hours. When she came back, the Caldwell carriage was still in the drive. That surprised her. She had expected an introduction tea, perhaps a walk through the garden, and a polite departure. 6 hours was not a polite visit. 6 hours was something else. She went around to the kitchen entrance the way she always did when she didn't want to be seen coming or going, and found Mary, the cook, who had been with the Whitmores for 20 years, and who Clara trusted more than almost anyone, standing at the kitchen table with an expression of contained excitement. "He's still here," Clara said. "He is." Mary lowered her voice. "Been talking to your sister in the garden. And then he asked your mama about the East Fields." The Fields started asking questions about the soil, about the crops, about how the drainage was managed after the flooding 3 years back. Mary gave Clara a significant look. "Your mama didn't know the answers." Clara set down her account books. "I imagine not," she said. "She told him she'd have someone fetch you." Clara was very still for a moment. "She didn't." "She did." "Mary, she specifically—" "I know what she specifically," Mary said, not unkindly. "But when a man like Nathaniel Caldwell starts asking questions and the mistress of the house doesn't have answers, practical matters take over." Clara looked down at her dress. Still her second best. Still not very good. Still had ink on her finger. "Where are they?" "Front parlor now. Your mama sent Thomas to find you 20 minutes ago." "Thomas didn't find me." "No," Mary agreed. "He didn't." Clara took a breath. Then she picked up her account books, walked through the kitchen, down the hall, and opened the parlor door. The room held 3 people. Her mother, who looked up with an expression of relief, and something else, something complicated that Clara would unpack later. Isabella, who was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was uncomfortable, but trying not to show it. And Nathaniel Caldwell, who was standing by the window and turned when the door opened. He looked at Clara the way he had looked at her in the magnolia shadow. That same unreadable thing. "Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said quickly. "This is my elder daughter Clara. She manages, that is, she assists with the estate accounts. I thought she might be able to answer your questions about the East Fields." "Miss Whitmore." He inclined his head. "Mr. Caldwell." Clara stayed near the door. She was aware that she hadn't been invited to sit. She was aware of exactly how she looked and what she was carrying and what the ink on her finger said about where she'd been and what she'd been doing. "My mother said you had questions about the drainage on the East Fields." "I do. The flooding in 1813 compromised the lower third of that field. We rerouted the runoff channel 2 years ago. It's not perfect, but it's functional. The soil quality in the affected area is down about 30% from where it should be, but we've been rotating crops to let it recover." She looked at him directly. "What specifically were you asking about?" A pause. Your mother mentioned you'd been attempting to negotiate a land lease with one of the neighboring properties, he said. The Harmon land. I was there today. How did it go? It was a direct question, straightforwardly curious. He asked it the way a man asks who already knows how to receive an honest answer. Not well, Clara said. Mr. Harmon is willing to extend our mill payment by 30 days, but he wants 2% interest on the extension and first right of purchase if we ever sell the South Paddock. I told him I'd need to consider it. She was aware of her mother's sharp inhale. She kept her eyes on Caldwell. And will you consider it? He asked. I'm going to find a better option, Clara said. The interest is too high, and we'd be mortgaging future flexibility to solve a short-term problem. But I have until the end of next week, so there's still time. Another pause. Longer this time. How long have you been managing the estate accounts? He asked. 4 years. Since your father died. It wasn't a question. He'd done his research. Yes, Clara said. He looked at her for a moment that felt very level and very clear. Then he said, "Thank you, Miss Whitmore. That answers my question." He turned back toward the window. Clara waited a beat long enough that leaving immediately would have been rude, and then excused herself and walked back out of the parlor. She stood in the hallway with her account books pressed against her chest and her heart doing something unexpected and inconvenient, and she told herself very firmly that it meant nothing. A man like Nathaniel Caldwell was going to marry Isabella. That was already decided. And Clara had $60 and a mill payment and a 30-day extension to think about instead. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. He always arrived in the morning and stayed through midday. He sat in the garden with Isabella. He was unfailingly courteous, attentive when she spoke, and thoughtful in the way that a man is thoughtful when he is working to be fair to someone he isn't entirely certain about yet. Clara observed this from a careful distance and told herself she was not observing it. She was always working when he arrived, always had somewhere reasonable to be. But the property was not large, and the paths crossed, and she was not always successful at being invisible. On the third Tuesday, she was fixing the latch on the east pasture gate when she heard footsteps on the path behind her and turned to find Nathaniel Caldwell walking alone without his hat, looking like a man who had taken a deliberate detour. She straightened. "Mr. Caldwell? Miss Whitmore." He stopped a few feet away. "Did you find a better option for the mill payment?" She blinked. He remembered. "I did," she said. "I spoke with the Fielding brothers in Charlottesville. They were willing to purchase the grain forward at current price. It covers the payment without the interest or the land concession. That's a better solution. It has risks. Committing the grain forward means we're exposed if the price rises. But you assessed that risk and decided it was manageable." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her the way she was beginning to think of as the Caldwell looked level and serious, and somehow more present than most people managed to be when they were standing in front of you. "My father made bad decisions." She said, not sure why she was telling him this, and he didn't tell anyone, and when he died, there was nothing left but the shape of the life we'd been living. So I learned to read the accounts. I learned to read contracts. I learned to ask the questions nobody wanted to ask because the alternative was losing everything. She paused. "I'm not sure why I'm saying that." "Because I asked," he said simply. "And because you're someone who answers questions honestly when they're asked honestly." She looked at him. "You're courting my sister," she said. "I'm aware." "Then I'm not sure what we're doing out here." He was quiet for a beat. "I'm not entirely sure either," he said. "But I find that I keep wanting to ask you things. And I find that your answers are the most honest I've received in a considerable amount of time." Clara felt something shift in her chest, something she immediately tried to press back into place. "Mr. Caldwell," she said carefully, "I think you should go back to the garden." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once picked up the hat she hadn't noticed he was carrying, and walked back toward the house. Clara turned back to the gate latch. Her hands were steady, but it took her 3 tries to get it closed. The storm came on a Thursday, not a gentle summer rain, the kind that farmers welcomed and women called refreshing. This was the kind of storm that came in from the mountains with serious intentions. The sky turned the color of old iron around 2 in the afternoon, and by 3 the wind had knocked over the garden furniture and the horses were making the particular noise horses made when they knew something bad was coming. Nathaniel happened to be present. He had arrived that morning for what had become the established routine time in the garden with Isabella, polite conversation with Margaret. A careful, courteous performance of courtship that everyone involved understood was proceeding towards some conclusion that hadn't quite been named yet. He was in the parlor when the first real crack of thunder hit. Clara was in the barn. She had been watching the sky since noon and had already moved the most valuable equipment to higher ground. But there were still animals loose in the east pasture that needed to come in, and there was the matter of the old storage shed near the creek, whose roof she'd been meaning to reinforce for 6 months and hadn't had time, and that shed currently contained approximately $40 worth of equipment they could not afford to lose. She was already running when the rain started. The creek was rising fast. She could see it from 50 yards away, that brown, churning, purposeful rising that meant the storm had already broken upstream and was sending everything downstream as fast as it could move. The shed was maybe 30 minutes from flooding. She got the doors open, got her hands on the first piece of equipment, and started pulling. It was heavy. She pulled anyway. She had gotten the harness rack and one of the good plows to higher ground when she heard boots splashing in the mud behind her, and turned to find Nathaniel Caldwell standing in the rain without his jacket which he was offering to her. She stared at him. "Put it on," he said. "I don't need it." "Miss Whitmore, there are 3 more things in that shed, and about 20 minutes before the creek takes them," she said. "If you want to help grab the fence post driver." He looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he waded into the shed. They worked in silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of strangers, or the careful silence of people who were pretending not to notice each other. The silence of 2 people who understood what needed to happen and were both committed to making it happen. Howe was strong. She was faster. She knew where everything was and could direct him without stopping what she was doing. He followed direction without ego, without question, without the particular male tendency she had encountered before, to reframe himself as the one in charge of a situation that wasn't his to run. The last piece, a heavy millstone replacement disc, nearly did them both in. It took both of them rain running into their eyes, feet sliding in the mud, and Clara saying, don't stop, keep going," through her teeth. And then they had it on higher ground, and the water was lapping at the shed floor, and it was over. Clara stood in the rain and looked at what they'd saved. She was soaked to the skin. Her hair had come completely out of its pins. Her dress was going to be a loss. She didn't care about any of that. "Thank you," she said. Nathaniel was standing a few feet away, equally soaked, looking at the rising water with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You knew this was coming," he said. "Since noon." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I did. I told Thomas to bring the horses in, and I left a note for my mother about the animals in the east pasture." She paused. "She doesn't usually read the notes." He turned and looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the polite glance of a man acknowledging a woman who has spoken to him. Not the careful consideration of a man assessing useful information. Something more direct than either of those things, and considerably less comfortable. "You've been holding this entire property together by yourself," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara looked away toward the creek. "Someone has to," she said. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." The rain was still falling, but lighter now, the storm moving on. The way storms did all that fury, and then the slow retreat. In the east pasture she could hear Thomas calling to the horses, so he'd gotten her note after all. "Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel said. "Mr. Caldwell. I owe you an honest conversation." Clara felt something cold that had nothing to do with the rain. "You don't owe me anything," she said carefully. "I think I do." He picked up his jacket from where he'd dropped it in the mud at the start of everything, and he held it for a moment without offering it to her this time, just held it like he needed something to do with his hands. "I came to Harrow County to find a wife. Someone to manage my household, represent my family in society, give me a partnership that made sense. Isabella is, Isabella is a lovely young woman who is not sure she wants to be anyone's practical arrangement, he said. And I am a man who has spent 3 weeks telling himself he came here for one reason while finding himself thinking about something else entirely. Clara was very still. Don't, she said. I'm not saying anything improper. You're about to. I'm being honest. You're complicating a situation that is already arranged, Clara said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. My mother has planned this. My family needs this. Isabella is not what I think about, he said quietly. The words landed. Clara turned away. Go back to the house, Mr. Caldwell, she said. Clean up. Have some tea. Tell my mother the storm was very dramatic and everyone is fine, because that's what I'm going to do. A long pause. And what are you going to think about Miss Whitmore? He asked. When you're telling your mother everyone is fine. Clara didn't answer. She picked up the harness rack that had shifted in the mud and carried it to the barn and didn't look back. But her hands, those practical ink-stained, never quite steady enough hands, shook all the way there. That night, Clara sat at her father's writing desk, with the account books open and the candle burning low. She had added up the numbers 4 times. They came out the same every time, which was the thing about numbers. They didn't care what you wanted. They told you what was true. The Whitmore estate could survive another year. Maybe a year and a half if the harvest was good and the mill payment held and nothing broke down that she couldn't fix herself. A marriage between Isabella and Nathaniel Caldwell would solve everything. The debts, the payments, the slow grinding erosion of a family trying to maintain the shape of a life that no longer had the substance to support it. It was simple arithmetic. Clara was good at arithmetic. She closed the books, blew out the candle, and in the dark, for exactly 60 seconds, she let herself feel the thing she'd been refusing to feel all day, the particular inconvenient, entirely useless ache of a woman who has just realized that the most decent man she has ever met is standing in the middle of a situation where she has no right to want him. 60 seconds. Then she lit the candle again, opened the account books, and went back to work. Because someone had to, and it was always going to be her. The storm had passed, but Clara Whitmore had no way of knowing that the real storm had only just begun, and that Nathaniel Caldwell, a man who had always trusted numbers and logic and practical arrangements, was about to discover that some things could not be calculated in advance. Clara didn't sleep that night. She told herself it was the accounts. The numbers had a way of pulling her back when she thought she was done with them. One more column, one more cross-check, one more calculation that refused to balance. But the accounts were balanced. She had checked them 4 times. The numbers were fine. It was everything else that wasn't. She sat at the writing desk until the candle burned down to nothing and the room went dark around her. And then she just sat in the dark for a while, which was something she never did, because sitting in the dark was the kind of thing that invited thoughts she didn't have time for. Tonight, the thoughts came anyway. She kept hearing his voice. That steady, direct, entirely unperformed way he had of speaking, the way he asked questions like he actually expected the truth back, the way he said, "Not what I think about," in the rain with the creek rising behind them, and mud on his hands, and not a single ounce of drama about it. Just that clean, honest statement dropped into the air between them like something he'd been carrying for a while and finally set down. She pressed her hands flat against the desk. "Stop it," she told herself. Then she got up, went to bed, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. The next morning she was in the kitchen at 5, helping Mary start the bread, because if her hands were doing something useful, her head would have less room to wander. Mary didn't ask questions. Mary never asked questions, which was one of the many reasons Clara trusted her. They worked in companionable silence for a while, flour and water, and the particular rhythm of kneading that required just enough attention to crowd out other things. And then Mary said without looking up, "He stayed late last night." Clara kept kneading. "I know." "Had a long talk with your mama after supper." "I know that too." "Your mama was smiling at breakfast in a way I haven't seen in 4 years." Clara set the dough aside to rest, dusted her hands. "Then it's going well," she said. "Is it?" It wasn't a question. Mary had a gift for making statements sound like questions, and questions sound like statements, and Clara had learned over 20 years to hear the difference. Isabella needs this, Clara said. The family needs this. It's the only reasonable outcome. Mary shaped her loaf with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Funny thing about reasonable outcomes. What about them? They don't always feel reasonable while you're living them. Clara looked at her. Mary looked at her bread. I'll be in the barn, Clara said. She was halfway to the door when Mary said quietly, He asked about you. Before he left last night. Asked your mama if you were well after the storm. Clara stopped. Her hand was on the doorframe. She told him you were perfectly fine and very busy, Mary continued. The way she says it when she wants a topic to be over. That's an accurate description of my situation, Clara said. Perfectly fine and very busy. She went to the barn. He came back on Saturday. Clara had planned to be at the fielding mill by 8. She had her boots on and her account books under her arm and was walking down the hall at 7:40 when she heard the carriage and stopped so fast she nearly ran into the wall. She stood very still. She heard her mother's voice rising to greet him, that practiced musical warmth that Margaret Whitmore deployed like a tool. She heard Isabella's lighter tone. She heard the sound of the front door opening and footsteps on the porch and the particular quality of silence that meant everyone was arranging themselves in the parlor. Clara walked to the back door. Then she stopped again. She stood in the hallway with her hand on the back door and her account books pressed to her chest and her boots still on, and she thought about $60 and mill payments and reasonable outcomes, and she thought about his voice saying, "Not what I think about." And she stood there for 30 seconds that felt considerably longer than 30 seconds. Then she heard his voice deeper than the women's carrying through the house, with the quiet authority of a man who didn't need to raise it, saying something she couldn't quite make out. And her mother's response, "Oh, I believe Clara has already gone out for the morning." And then his voice again, clearer this time. "I'd like to speak with her if possible before she goes." A pause. Her mother. "She's very busy, Mr. Caldwell. Mrs. Whitmore." Still quiet. Still completely unhurried. "I'd like to speak with Miss Clara, please." Clara heard the exact moment her mother's resistance collapsed. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a small, surrendering silence, the sound of a woman who needed something from a man and had just calculated that refusing this particular request was not worth the cost. "Of course," Margaret said. "I'll have Mary fetch her." Clara walked back through the hall and came in through the front door, which was the entrance she was not supposed to use when company was present. "You don't need to fetch me," she said. "I'm here." Her mother's expression did a complicated journey in approximately 2 seconds. Surprise, irritation, calculation, and the social performance of pleasantness, and arrived at a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Clara, I thought you'd gone out." "I was about to." Clara looked at Nathaniel Caldwell. He was standing near the fireplace, and he had that look again, the one she was starting to recognize as his actual face beneath the public-facing version. "You wanted to speak to me, Mr. Caldwell." "I did. I have an appointment at the fielding mill at 8. "I know. I'll be brief." He glanced at Margaret with a courtesy that was also very clearly a dismissal. "If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Whitmore." Her mother's smile held. "Of course." She touched Isabella's arm. "Come, darling, let's see about the garden." Isabella stood up, and as she passed Clara, she did the thing with her eyes that was always asking a more complicated question, and Clara gave her the smallest nod she could manage, which she hoped meant, "I don't know either, but I'm handling it," and then they were alone. The room felt different with just the two of them in it. Not smaller exactly, just more honest. "Sit down," he said. Then immediately, "I'm sorry, this is your home, I shouldn't." "It's all right." Clara sat. Not because he'd suggested it, but because her legs made the decision without consulting her. "What did you want to say?" He didn't sit. He moved away from the fireplace and stood near the window, which meant she had to look slightly up at him, and she recognized this as unintentional. He wasn't a man who arranged himself for effect, but it was still the geometry of the situation. "I owe you an apology," he said. For what? For Thursday, in the rain. He turned to face her. I said something I shouldn't have said. Not because it wasn't true, but because it put you in an impossible position, and that wasn't fair. Clara looked at him. I don't need you to apologize, she said carefully. I'm going to anyway. Mr. Caldwell, I came to this family with a specific intention, he said. I made that intention clear, and then I said something to you that contradicted it in the middle of a storm when you were already managing a crisis, and the last thing you needed was... He stopped, started again. It was selfish. I was thinking about what I was feeling, and not what it would cost you to hear it. Clara was quiet for a moment. What it would cost me, she repeated. Yes. You thought about that. I thought about very little else Thursday night, if I'm being honest. She looked at her hands. The ink was there again. Second finger of her right hand. The permanent stain of a woman who spent too much time with ledgers and not enough time pretending she didn't. I appreciate the apology, she said, and I accept it. She looked up. Now I need you to go back to courting my sister, and I need to go to the fielding mill, and we should both try very hard to behave sensibly. A beat. What if I don't want to behave sensibly? He said. Then you should have thought of that before you came to Harrow County looking for a practical arrangement. Maybe my definition of practical has changed. Mr. Caldwell. Her voice was sharper than she intended. My family owes money to 11 different creditors. My mother hasn't slept a full night in 4 years because she's afraid of what she'll find in the morning. My sister is 21 years old, and she deserves a life that isn't defined by this estate's problems. She stood up. That is practical. That is what this family needs. And whatever you think you're feeling about me is real, he said. The word hit the room like a stone hitting water. Clara stopped. It's real. Miss Whitmore, he said, and his voice was very quiet now, very steady, the voice of a man who was not performing this. I understand every argument you're making. I understand the arithmetic of your family's situation. I've been doing the same calculations you have. But I'm standing here telling you that what I feel when I talk to you, when I watch you work, when I think about the woman who ran into a storm to save $40 worth of equipment without a second thought. I'm telling you that's real. And I think you know it's real. And I think that scares you considerably more than any debt does. Silence. Complete, total, awful silence. Clara's heart was doing something loud and inconvenient that she hoped was not visible. You need to leave, she said. I know. And I need to go to the mill. I know that too. Neither of them moved. Then from somewhere outside the window, they heard Margaret's voice calling Isabella's name in the particular pitch she used when she was looking for someone and trying to sound casual about it. The spell, or whatever it was, broke. Clara picked up her account books. Good morning, Mr. Caldwell, she said. She walked out the front door. She didn't look back. But for the entire 2-mile walk to the fielding mill in the thick summer heat, with the red clay road hard under her boots, she heard nothing but the word real ringing in her ears like a bell that wouldn't stop. The trouble began on a Tuesday. Not with Nathaniel Caldwell, not directly. The trouble began, as trouble in Harrow County usually did, with Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor Marsh was 58 years old, had been widowed twice, and operated the county's social structure with the precision and enthusiasm of a woman who had made a lifetime study of other people's vulnerabilities. She was not cruel exactly. She was something more efficient than cruel. She was strategic, and she had the particular gift of making her strategies sound like concern. She came to call on Wednesday morning the week after the storm, with 2 of her daughters and a basket of preserves that Clara recognized immediately as a pretext. Clara answered the door herself. Mary was at the market, and Thomas was with the horses, and opened it to find Eleanor Marsh standing on the porch with her careful smile and her careful eyes already moving past Clara into the house. Miss Whitmore. A pause of exactly the right length to communicate that she'd expected someone else. Is your mother at home? She is. Come in, Mrs. Marsh. She led them to the parlor, went to find Margaret. And then she made the mistake, or perhaps not a mistake, perhaps a choice she'd make again if given the chance of lingering in the hallway where she could hear. Margaret, my dear. Eleanor's voice had dropped to the register that meant serious conversation. I'll be direct. People are talking. About what? Margaret cautious. About Nathaniel Caldwell's visits. Specifically about a pause for effect, who he seems most interested in during those visits. Silence. He is courting Isabella, Margaret said. He arrived for the purpose of courting Isabella. That's understood. But people have noticed, and you know how people are, Margaret. I'm only telling you what's being said, that he has had a considerable number of private conversations with Clara. The hallway was very quiet. Clara helps him with estate questions, Margaret said. She's been answering his questions about the property. It's perfectly sensible. Of course. Eleanor's tone made perfectly sensible sound like the most suspicious thing she'd ever heard. But there is a perception, darling, and perception matters, as you know better than anyone. If people begin to believe that Nathaniel Caldwell has divided his attention between your daughters, or worse, that he is more interested in the elder than the younger, it will do Isabella no good. And it will do the family's reputation no good. And Clara's reputation, of course, another weighted pause, would not survive it at all. Clara's hands tightened around the account books she was still carrying. There it was. Not cruel. Strategic. Clara's reputation would not survive it. Meaning Clara would be seen as a woman who had tried to steal her sister's suitor. Meaning whatever standing she had, and it wasn't much, but it was something, would be gone. Meaning every creditor, every neighbor, every person in Harrow County who was already inclined to pity rather than respect. The Whitmore elder daughter would have a story to tell about her instead. She heard her mother say very quietly, "I'll speak with her." She walked away before she heard anything else. Margaret found her in the barn. This was where difficult conversations happened between them, always in the barn, always with Clara doing something with her hands, always with that practical distance that kept emotions from getting entirely out of control. "You heard," Margaret said. "Most of it." Margaret came and stood near the grain barrel that Clara used as a desk. She looked older than usual in the way she always looked older when the gap between the life she'd planned and the life she had became impossible to ignore. "Eleanor is not wrong," Margaret said, "about perception. I know. People are watching Clara. They are always watching a family in our position. Any misstep, Mama." Clara looked up from the harness she was mending. "I know. I understand. I have been managing this family's public position for 4 years, including protecting Isabella from every piece of gossip that has come near her. I know how this county works." "Then you know what I'm going to ask. You're going to ask me to stay away from Nathaniel Caldwell. I'm going to ask you to be very careful." "That's the same thing." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He asked about you again," she said finally. "Last Saturday, before he left." A pause. "He asked if you were happy." Clara's hands stopped moving. "He asked if I was happy," she repeated flatly. "I told him you were content, that you found satisfaction in your work." "That's a very kind interpretation. Clara, I am going to stay away from Nathaniel Caldwell." Clara set the harness down and looked at her mother directly. "I have always understood my position in this family. I have never acted against Isabella's interests. I'm not going to start now." Her voice was even. She was proud of how even it was. "But I need you to understand something in return." Margaret waited. "I need you to stop treating me like a problem to be managed," Clara said. "I have kept this estate alive for 4 years. I have protected this family from things you don't even know about because I didn't want you to be frightened. I have done all of that, and I have asked for very little in return. So if you want me to step back from a situation I didn't create and didn't ask for, I will. But I am not going to apologize for it." Her mother looked at her for a long moment, and then, and this was the thing, Clara would remember longest. Margaret's expression did something it almost never did. It broke just slightly, just for a moment, a flicker of something that might have been guilt. "I know what I've asked of you," Margaret said quietly. "More than I should have. More than was fair." She stopped. "I know that, Clara. I do." Clara looked at her. "I know you do," she said. And she meant it. But knowing something and being able to change it were two different things, and they were both too old for this family to pretend otherwise. The gossip moved faster than Clara had expected. By the following Monday, it had shape and direction. She heard it first from Thomas, who heard it from the blacksmith, who heard it from someone who'd been at the Marsh house for dinner. The story as it traveled had grown in the way stories always grew, adding detail with each retelling until the thing that had been a vague social concern became a specific pointed narrative. The story going around Harrow County was this: Nathaniel Caldwell had come to court the beautiful Whitmore sister and had become somehow distracted by the plain one. The plain one, and this was the part that stung with the specificity of something designed to sting, had used her access to the estate accounts to make herself indispensable to him. Had used the practical conversations about debts and payments and drainage fields as a way of inserting herself into his attention. It was efficient as a piece of damage. Clara had to admire the engineering of it. She heard it on Monday. By Wednesday, it had reached Isabella. She knew because Isabella came to the barn. Isabella never came to the barn. The barn was Clara's territory, the way the parlor was Margaret's, and the garden was Isabella's. They each had the places they belonged, and Isabella belonged in places that didn't smell like horses and grain. But she came. She came with mud on her boots that she'd gotten from crossing the yard too fast, and her hair slightly out of its careful arrangement, and that look on her face, not the pretty composed look she wore for company, but the real one underneath the one Clara had been watching all their lives. "Clara," she said. "I know," Clara said. "Do you?" "I've heard the story, yes." Isabella came and sat on the grain barrel, which she'd never done before. Sat there with her good dress and her muddy boots and looked at her sister. "He asked Mama if he could take you riding," Isabella said. Clara went very still. "What?" "Yesterday. I was in the next room. He asked Mama if it would be appropriate for him to invite you," he said. "He had estate questions. It was all very proper, but Mama said no." A beat. She was very kind about it. She told him it wouldn't be suitable, and he didn't argue, but his face... Isabella stopped. "Clara, his face." "Isabella, he likes you." The words were simple and direct, and landed with the force of something that had been building for a long time. "He came here for me, and he likes you. And I need you to tell me what to do with that because I genuinely don't know." Clara looked at her sister. At the real Isabella underneath the performance, the young woman who was kind and frightened, and who had spent her entire life being valued for the one thing she hadn't chosen and couldn't change. "Do you want to marry him?" Clara asked. A pause. "He's a good man," Isabella said. "That's not what I asked. He's..." Isabella stopped, started again. "He's serious and careful, and he doesn't look at me the way other men do. He doesn't look at me like I'm something he wants to own. But he also..." She pressed her hands flat against the grain barrel. "He asks me questions about what I think and what I want, and I answer them, and I can see him listening, really listening, and then I can see him..." She looked up. "Wishing I was you." The barn was very quiet. "You deserve someone who wishes he was looking at you," Clara said. "So do you." The words hit harder than she expected. "This isn't about what I deserve," Clara said. "The family." "I know about the family," Isabella said sharply. "I have always known about the family. I know what I'm supposed to do and why I'm supposed to do it." She looked at Clara. "But I'm 21 years old, and I'm tired of everyone deciding what my life should cost." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Isabella," she said carefully, "if you tell me you want Nathaniel Caldwell, if you tell me you could be happy with him, I will get out of the way, and I will never speak of this again. I promise you that." A long silence. Isabella looked at her hands. "I want to fall in love with someone who wants to fall in love with me," she said finally. "Not someone who has already fallen for someone else and is trying very hard to pretend he hasn't." Clara closed her eyes. "That is not a situation I created," she said. "It came out smaller than she meant it. I know." Isabella's voice was gentle now, the way it got when she was saying something true. "I know you didn't. That's why I'm not angry at you." She slid off the grain barrel, smoothed her dress. "But Clara, someone has to say something to him. Because the way this is going, he's going to make some kind of offer to Mama, and Mama is going to accept it, and he's going to end up married to me, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life looking at his face when he thinks I'm not watching." She walked to the door, stopped. "He's coming Thursday," she said. "I thought you should know." She left. Clara stood alone in the barn for a long time. Then she picked up the harness, set it down, picked it up again, and set it down again. This was the arithmetic she couldn't solve. Every calculation she ran came out wrong. If she stayed away, the family lost its best chance. If she didn't stay away, Isabella was the one who paid for it. And Clara's own feelings. The things she kept folding up and putting away every time it tried to unfold were not a factor in any calculation she was willing to do. Except that they were. That was the problem. They were. Thursday came. Clara was not in the barn, and not at the fielding mill, and not on the road to anywhere else. She was in the kitchen standing at the table with Mary, and when she heard the carriage, she heard it clearly, and she stayed right where she was. But it was what happened an hour later that changed everything. She heard the voices before she heard the words, her mother's high and bright and brittle, Nathaniel's lower steadier, and underneath them both, completely silent, Isabella, who had apparently stopped performing. Then she heard her mother's voice break. Not in grief. In something worse, in the particular helpless sound of a woman who has been holding a plan together for so long that the moment it starts to come apart, she doesn't have the strength to catch it. Clara was in the hallway before she'd decided to go. She opened the parlor door. The scene inside was very quiet and very tense. Margaret was standing near the fireplace with her hands pressed together. Isabella was by the window with her face turned away. Nathaniel Caldwell was in the center of the room, and when Clara opened the door, he turned toward her immediately, not with surprise, but with something that looked very much like relief. "Clara," Margaret said, "this is not the time. What happened?" Clara looked at Nathaniel. He held her gaze. "I told your mother," he said, "that I cannot in good conscience continue to court your sister when my intentions have changed." The words fell into the room like stones. "You," Margaret's voice was shaking. "You came here for—" "I came here for a practical arrangement," he said. He looked at Margaret with the kind of directness that wasn't cruel, but refused to be softened either. "I was honest about that from the beginning, and I have spent 6 weeks in this house trying to be fair to everyone, and discovering that fairness to everyone is not possible in this situation." He paused. "I will not marry Isabella. It would be wrong to both of us." "And what about this family?" Margaret's voice cracked. "What about everything we— Mama?" Isabella's voice from the window, quiet and final. "Stop." Margaret looked at her daughter. "Stop," Isabella said again. "He's right. And you know he's right." The room seemed to exhale. Clara stood in the doorway and felt the weight of the entire situation. The debts, the creditors, the $60 and the mill payment, and the forward-sold grain, and 4 years of holding it all together with her bare hands, settle onto her shoulders all at once. And then Nathaniel Caldwell looked at her, not with triumph, not with possession, with the same quiet, undecorated honesty he'd had in the magnolia shadow on the first day when he'd looked at her and she hadn't known what to do with it. "I'm sorry," he said, not to her mother, to Clara. "I know this makes your situation harder." "You should not have said anything yet," Clara said. Her voice was almost steady. "You should have taken more time." "I've had enough time," he said. "I knew in the first week. I spent 5 more weeks trying to talk myself out of it, and I'm done doing that." "And what exactly," Clara said carefully, "do you think happens now?" "I think," he said, "that's up to you." Silence. Her mother was watching her. Isabella was watching her. Nathaniel Caldwell was watching her. And Clara stood in the doorway of the parlor she had never been invited to use, with ink on her fingers and her second-best dress, and 4 years of weight behind her eyes, and she looked at the most honest man she had ever met, and she felt something close. Then she turned to her mother. "I need to speak with Mr. Caldwell alone," she said. "Please." Margaret pressed her lips together. Then she nodded once, took Isabella's arm, and walked out. The door closed. The room went quiet, and Clara looked at Nathaniel Caldwell across the space between them and thought for the first time in a very long time that she had no idea what was going to happen next. She had no calculation for this, no ledger, no account book, just the summer heat pressing in through the windows and the sound of her own heartbeat, and a man who had upended everything standing very still in the middle of her family's parlor, waiting. "You have made everything harder," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know. My family needed. I know what your family needed. I also know what you need. And I know Miss Whitmore." He stopped. "Clara, I know that you have spent 4 years making sure everyone around you had what they needed while telling yourself you didn't matter." He took a step toward her. Just one. "And I am standing here to tell you that you are wrong." Her throat was very tight. "This is not how things work," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. People will talk." "They already are." "My mother." "Your mother wants what's best for her family," he said. "I think if given time she may discover that I am not the enemy she's looking at right now." "And Isabella," he said quietly, "told me 2 weeks ago that she hoped I would say what I said today. She told me that the night of the storm when I went back inside, she looked at her mother and said, and I believe I have the words right, 'I think he is looking at the wrong sister.'" Clara stared at him. "She said that." "She did." The tight thing in Clara's chest shifted, cracked, let something through. "I don't know how to do this," she said. And it was the most honest thing she'd said to another person in 4 years. "I know how to run accounts and negotiate payments and fix barn latches and calculate risk. I know how to hold things together. I don't—" She stopped. "I don't know how to let someone—" "I know," he said. "I know you don't." He was close now. Close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she'd been someone who did that sort of thing. "I am not asking you to know how," he said. "I am asking you to try." Clara looked at him. At this serious, careful, entirely decent man who had come to Harrow County looking for a practical arrangement and had instead looked directly at her, the woman in the magnolia shadow, the woman with the account books, the woman nobody came to find unless they needed something and decided she was worth changing everything for. "You'll need to speak with my mother," she said finally. Something in his expression shifted. Not a smile exactly. Something quieter than a smile. "I intend to," he said. "She's going to ask about the debts." "I know." "She's going to ask about Isabella's future." "I have thoughts about that as well." "She's going to be—" "Clara." His voice was very gentle. "Are you saying yes?" She looked at her hands. The ink. The chapped skin. The evidence of everything she'd been doing for 4 years while the world looked somewhere else. She looked back up at him. "I'm saying," she said carefully, "that I am not saying no." It was not a declaration. It was not a romance. It was the most honest answer she had for the most impossible situation she'd ever stood in the middle of. But Nathaniel Caldwell looked at her like she'd given him everything. Outside the window, somewhere in the garden, she could hear Isabella's voice, light and unguarded. In a way, it almost never was saying something to Mary that made them both laugh. Clara listened to that sound. And for the first time in a very long time, something in her chest that had been wound very tight started slowly to let go. The conversation with her mother lasted 2 hours. Clara wasn't in the room for most of it. That was intentional. Nathaniel had asked to speak with Margaret alone. And Clara had agreed because she understood that some conversations needed to happen without her in the middle of them. She went to the kitchen, sat at the table, didn't touch the account books. Mary set a cup of tea in front of her and didn't say a word. Clara wrapped both hands around the cup and listened to the sound of voices coming through the wall, her mother's rising and falling, sometimes sharp, sometimes low. Nathaniel's steady and unhurried the way it always was, the way that had started to feel less like stubbornness and more like a kind of strength she hadn't known was possible in a person. 40 minutes in, she heard her mother cry. Not the performative kind. The real kind, short and hard, and quickly suppressed the sound of a woman who had held something together for so long that the moment someone offered to share the weight, her body didn't know what to do except break a little. Clara stared at her tea. Isabella came and sat across from her. Neither of them spoke. They just sat together the way they had sat together as children during thunderstorms, not because the company made them less afraid, but because being less alone was its own kind of comfort. An hour later, Mary's door opened, and Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Clara. "She wants to speak with you," he said. Clara stood. "How is she?" "She's—" He paused, choosing carefully. "She's being very brave." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she walked past him down the hall and into the parlor. Margaret was sitting in the good chair. Her eyes were red. Her hands were folded in her lap, with the rigid precision of a woman who had cried as much as she was going to allow herself and was now back in control of her face. She looked at Clara when she came in. "Sit down," she said. Clara sat. A long silence. "I wants to pay the debts," Margaret said finally. "All of them. He has already contacted 2 of the creditors. He said he would handle the mill payment and the Harmon extension and—" She stopped. "He said he has been looking into the accounts since his second visit." Clara went very still. "He's been looking into the accounts. He hired someone, a solicitor in Charlottesville. He said—" Margaret's voice tightened. "He said he wanted to understand what we were actually dealing with before he made any decisions." "That's—" Clara stopped, started again. "When did he do that?" 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. Before the storm. Before the conversation in the rain. He had already been doing the work 3 weeks ago quietly, without telling her, without making it a negotiation, or a bargain, or a condition of anything. The thing in her chest that had started to loosen. Thursday did something complicated and aching. "Mama," she said carefully. "What did you tell him?" Margaret looked at her hands. "I told him he was not what I planned," she said. "I know. I told him—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again, and this time her voice was quieter, stripped of its practiced edges. "I told him that you have given more to this family than anyone will ever know, and that you deserved—" She couldn't finish it. Clara waited. "I told him," Margaret said finally, "that if you wanted him, I would not stand in the way." Clara looked at her mother, at the woman she had spent 4 years alternately protecting and resenting and loving with the specific complicated love of a person who understood someone's flaws completely and chose them anyway. "Thank you, Mama," she said. It came out smaller than she expected. Margaret nodded once sharply the way she did when emotion was threatening her composure. "He's a serious man," she said. "I didn't want serious. I wanted easy." A pause. "But I think serious might be what this family actually needs." Clara almost smiled. "I think so too." "Isabella will be fine," Margaret said. She said it the way she said things when she was deciding to believe them. "She's young. There will be others." "There will," Clara agreed. "And you." Margaret looked at her directly. "Clara, you have to let him—" She made a gesture with her hands the way she did when words weren't enough. "You can't keep yourself behind that desk. You understand." Clara thought about the 60 seconds in the dark, the candle she'd blown out and then relit, the account books at 4 in the morning. "I'm working on it," she said. What nobody had accounted for was Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor Marsh had not gotten where she was in Harrow County society by letting things resolve themselves quietly. She had built her position on the particular social currency of being the first to know and the fastest to define, and the story of Nathaniel Caldwell abandoning his courtship of the beautiful Whitmore sister in favor of the plain one was by any measure the most significant event in the county in 3 years. The version of the story she chose to tell was not kind. By the following Sunday, it had reached the church steps. By Monday, it was in the market. By Wednesday, it had taken a specific shape, hard-edged and deliberate, and that shape was this: Clara Whitmore, plain and overlooked and desperate, had manipulated a wealthy man through access to his practical concerns. had inserted herself into his business decisions, had used her sister's courtship as cover for her own scheme. Clara heard it from Thomas, who heard it from the blacksmith's boy, who said it with the apologetic eyes of someone who hated being the bearer of news that was also weapons. She heard it on Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, it had a new piece added that the Whitmore family's debts were worse than anyone knew, and that Clara had essentially sold herself to the highest bidder because no man of quality would have her otherwise. She was in the barn when that version reached her. Thomas told her with his boots very focused on the floor, and when he finished, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me, Thomas." He looked up miserable. "I'm sorry, Miss Clara." "Don't be sorry. It's better to know." She picked up the harness rack and moved it 2 feet for no reason except that she needed something to do with her body. "Go on back to the horses." He went. She stood alone in the barn and felt the story settle over her, the way a cold thing settles, not fast, not dramatic, but thorough, reaching into everything, changing the temperature of the whole room. She had known this was coming. She had told Nathaniel people will talk, and he had said they already are. Like that made it easier. It didn't make it easier. It made it real. The question was what she was going to do about it. She was still thinking about that when she heard boots on the barn floor and looked up and found Nathaniel Caldwell standing in the doorway, which was the second time in a month he had appeared in a place she hadn't expected him, and she was starting to think it might become a pattern. "You've heard," she said. "I came from the Marsh property," he said. His voice was completely even. "I paid Eleanor Marsh a visit this morning." Clara stared at him. "You did what?" "I wanted to speak with her directly." "Nathaniel." It was the first time she'd used his name without the formal address. Neither of them acknowledged it. "You should not have done that. That will make it worse, not better." "She was spreading lies about you." "She was spreading gossip about me, which is a different thing and significantly harder to stop by confrontation. I'm aware of that." He came further into the barn. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was managing something he felt strongly about. "I didn't go to confront her. I went to clarify the facts." Clara looked at him. "And how did that go?" A pause. "Less well than I'd hoped," he said. Despite everything, she almost laughed. Almost. "Eleanor Marsh doesn't deal in facts," Clara said. "She deals in narrative. You giving her your side of the story just gave her more material." "I know. I understand that now." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry. I was angry on your behalf and I acted before I thought." She looked at him. This careful, controlled man, who prided himself on deliberate action, admitting that anger had gotten the better of him. "You were angry on my behalf," she repeated. "Very." "That's—" She stopped. "That's not something I'm used to." "I know," he said. "You're going to have to get used to it." She looked away. "What exactly did you say to her?" "I told her that my intentions toward you were serious and honorable, that I had conducted myself with complete propriety, that any suggestion otherwise was false, and I would consider legal remedy if it continued." A beat. "She offered me more tea." Clara pressed her fingers to her forehead. "She offered you more tea?" "Yes, because she's already won the round and she knows it, and she's being gracious about it." "Yes," he said. That became apparent. "Nathaniel." Clara dropped her hand. "I have lived in this county my entire life. I know how Eleanor Marsh operates. The only way to survive her is to give people something else to talk about, something that reframes the story before her version calculates." She looked at him. "The story she's telling is, Clara Whitmore maneuvered a wealthy man. The story we need people to see is something else." He was watching her with that level attention. "What story?" he asked. "That's what I'm trying to work out," she said. They looked at each other. "The harvest fair is in 3 weeks," Clara said slowly. "The whole county will be there. Every person who has heard Eleanor's story will be standing in the same field." "Yes. If you and I appear there together publicly, deliberately as a couple, it either confirms her version or it contradicts it. It depends entirely on how we appear." And how do we need to appear? Clara thought about it. Like equals, she said. Not like a desperate woman who caught a rich man. Like two people who chose each other. She looked at him. Can you do that? Clara, he said quietly, but with absolute clarity. I am not performing anything. I am simply going to stand next to you in a field and be honest about who I am and who you are. She held his gaze for a long moment. That might be enough, she said. It will be enough, he said. She looked at him. This man who said things like they were facts and felt the uncertain ground under her feet shift just slightly toward solid. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. And then from outside, she heard Mary calling her name in the particular tone that meant something had happened that required immediate attention. It always did. What had happened was a letter. It had arrived while they were in the barn, hand-delivered by a man on horseback who had ridden from Charlottesville and hadn't waited for a reply. Mary had signed for it, seen the seal, and gone to find Clara immediately. The seal belonged to a firm Clara knew. She had spent 6 months corresponding with them the year after her father died, trying to understand the full shape of the estate's debts. They were one of the creditors her father had been most careful to keep hidden, which meant they were also the one she trusted least. She stood in the kitchen and opened the letter. Read it. Read it again. The room was very quiet. Nathaniel had followed her in. He was standing near the door reading her face, saying nothing. What is it? Mary asked. Clara looked up. There's a second mortgage, she said. On the main house. The kitchen went silent in a different way than kitchens usually went silent. What? Mary said. My father took out a second mortgage on the house 18 months before he died. Clara's voice was very flat. I didn't know about it. It wasn't in any of the accounts I found. It was with a separate firm in my father's name only, and they have been... She scanned the letter again. They've been waiting. They've been allowing interest to accumulate for 4 years. Allowing it to accumulate, Nathaniel said carefully, or being paid to allow it to accumulate. Clara looked at him. Something moved across his expression, quick and sharp, and focused the expression of a man connecting pieces he hadn't had in front of him before. Read me the name of the firm, he said. She did. His expression went very still. What do you know about them? She asked. More than I'd like, he said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and held out his hand for the letter. She gave it to him. He read it quickly, and she watched his face as he did, and what she saw there was not good. They've done this before, he said. Done what? This specific thing. Wait for a family to accumulate debt. Let it grow. Then arrive with the full amount at a moment calculated to cause maximum damage. He looked up. They did it to the Harrington family in Richmond 3 years ago. They lost their property in 2 weeks. Clara felt the cold thing settle deeper. How much? She asked. What's the total they're claiming? He read the figure from the letter. Mary made a sound she quickly suppressed. Clara did the arithmetic in her head automatically the way she always did, the habit of 4 years. It was more than she had. Considerably more. Even accounting for everything Nathaniel had offered to settle the mill payment, the Harmon debt, the other creditors. This was a separate, enormous thing sitting underneath all of it. They want payment, she said. By when? 6 weeks, Nathaniel said. 6 weeks, she repeated. The number landed in the room and sat there. Clara. Nathaniel's voice was very steady. This is manageable. It's a very large amount of money, which I have. She looked at him. You are not paying this debt. I am absolutely paying this debt. Nathaniel, we are not. You haven't made any kind of formal, I haven't agreed to. Clara. He set the letter down. I told your mother I intend to address the debts. All of them. I have the resources. This changes the number, but not the decision. This is not a small number. No, he said. It isn't. It's... She stopped. She couldn't make herself say too much. Because too much was a thing you said when you had another option, and she was doing the arithmetic fast in her head, and she did not have another option, and she hated that. She hated it with the specific bone-deep hatred of a woman who had spent 4 years refusing to be helpless and was currently being helpless. "Let me do one thing," she said. "What thing?" "Let me go to Charlottesville. Let me look at the original papers, the mortgage agreement. I want to see what my father signed and when and under what conditions." She looked at him. "Because if this firm held the debt for 4 years without contacting us, without sending a single payment request, without any communication at all, until now, that is not standard practice." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It isn't. Something is wrong with this debt," she said. "I don't know what yet, but I want to find out before we pay anyone anything." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll come with you." "You don't need to." "I'm coming with you," he said. "Not because you can't handle it alone, because you shouldn't have to." The kitchen was very quiet. Mary was looking at her mixing bowl with intense attention. Clara looked at Nathaniel. "All right," she said. "We leave tomorrow morning." Duh. They left at dawn. The road to Charlottesville was long and straight and mostly empty at that hour, which gave Clara too much time to think. She sat across from Nathaniel in the carriage properly, with the distance that the situation required, and watched the Virginia countryside move past the window, and thought about 6 weeks and second mortgages, and the particular sick feeling of discovering that the ground you'd been standing on had a hole in it you didn't know about. "What are you thinking?" Nathaniel asked. "That I should have found this sooner," she said. "You couldn't have found it. It was deliberately hidden." "Hidden things don't stay hidden unless nobody looks." "Your father may have hidden it specifically, so you wouldn't look," he said. "Not because he was trying to harm you, because he was ashamed." Clara thought about her father. The man she had loved and mourned, and then in those long months after the funeral, when she'd been going through papers by candlelight, slowly come to understand in a way that living with someone never quite allowed. "He was proud," she said. "He hated for anyone to know when things were wrong." Most men of his generation and position were the same. It didn't make it easier for the people he left behind. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "It didn't." A pause. "What do you think we'll find?" she asked. "I think we'll find that the terms of the mortgage are unusual. The timeline is too convenient. They wait 4 years, let interest accumulate, then arrive with a demand. 6 weeks before the harvest fair, when the whole county will be watching what happens to the Whitmore family." He looked at her. "Someone told them this was the right moment." Clara went still. "Someone told them," she said slowly. "That debt has been sitting dormant for 4 years. Why activate it now?" She thought about Eleanor Marsh, about the story moving through the county, about the timing the week after Nathaniel had formally ended his consideration of Isabella, the week after the gossip had its sharpest edges. "Eleanor Marsh wouldn't have the connections for something like this," she said. "No, but someone who wanted this sale to happen would." "What sale?" He looked at her steadily. "If the Whitmore estate can't pay this debt in 6 weeks, it goes to auction, and whoever already knows the amount of the debt and has the funds ready to move quickly would get the property at auction price," Clara finished. The road outside was very quiet. "Someone has been planning this," she said. Not a question. "I think so, yes." "For how long?" "Long enough to know when to activate a debt that had been sitting quietly for 4 years. Clara looked out the window. "My father borrowed money from these people," she said. "They held the debt. They waited. And now someone who knows the county, who knows the family, who knew that 4 years of accumulating interest would create a number large enough to force a sale." She stopped. "Who benefits from owning the Whitmore land?" "That," Nathaniel said, "is the question we're going to Charlottesville to answer." She looked at him. He looked back at her. "You already know who it is," she said. "A beat." "I have a suspicion," he said carefully. "Tell me." He hesitated, not the hesitation of someone keeping a secret, but the hesitation of someone choosing the right words for something hard. "James Harmon," he said. Clara felt the name land. James Harmon. The same James Harmon who had offered her the 30-day extension with the 2% interest. The same James Harmon whose land bordered the Whitmore property on the south side. The same James Harmon she had dealt with for 4 years politely and professionally, and with the careful deference of a woman who needed something from a man and had no leverage. "I wants the south paddock," she said. Her voice was flat with the flatness of someone who is keeping something very controlled. He's always wanted the south paddock. It connects his eastern fields. And if he acquires the full Whitmore property at auction, he controls the whole southern corridor, Clara said. The road to the creek, the mill access, She stopped. He's been building toward this, for years. I believe so. How was patient, she said, and there was something in her voice that was almost like admiration for the sheer cold calculation of it, except that it was her family's home and her mother's security and 4 years of her own life, so it wasn't admiration at all. Clara. He sat across from me in his parlor and offered me a 30-day extension, she said. He looked me in the eye. He poured tea. Her voice was tight now, the control slipping. He was kind about it. He was so... Clara. Nathaniel's voice was quiet, but it cut through. We're going to handle this. It's my family's home. I know. You can't just... I know I can't just, he said. I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about evidence. If Harmon arranged this, if he has a connection to this firm that can be documented, then this isn't just a debt. It's fraud. Clara looked at him. You can prove fraud, he said. That changes everything. She was quiet for a long moment. How, she said. By finding the paper trail, he said. Which is exactly what we're going to do when we get to Charlottesville. She looked at him, at this man who kept quietly and without announcement arriving in the middle of her worst moments and saying, we. Not I will fix it. Not let me handle it. We. She hadn't had a we in 4 years. She didn't know what to do with it, except that she wanted to hold on to it with both hands. All right, she said. The carriage kept moving. The road stretched ahead, and Clara Whitmore, who had held everything together alone for so long that alone felt like her natural state, sat across from a man who saw her completely and thought quietly and terrifyingly that maybe she had been wrong about what was possible. The offices of the firm were located on a narrow street that smelled of tobacco and old paper in a building that had the particular look of a place that handled money in ways it preferred not to announce. The man who received them was named Greer. He was 50 thin, with the careful eyes of someone who spent his professional life managing what people knew. He looked at Clara with polite dismissal. He looked at Nathaniel Caldwell with calculation. Mr. Caldwell. He extended his hand. This is an unexpected visit. We've come about the Whitmore mortgage, Nathaniel said. Of course. Greer gestured toward chairs. Please sit down. Can I offer? We'd like to see the original documents, Clara said. Greer looked at her. A quick reassessment. Miss Whitmore, he said. Certainly. I'll have them retrieved. A pause that lasted slightly too long. It may take some time. We'll wait, Clara said. He went into the back room. Nathaniel leaned toward her slightly. You saw it, he said quietly. His face when I said original documents, she said. Yes. He's nervous. He's nervous, she agreed. They waited. 20 minutes later, Greer returned with a folder. He set it on the desk between them. Clara reached for it before he finished putting it down. She read quickly. She had learned to read legal documents fast, learned it out of necessity, the same way she'd learned everything else. The date of the mortgage was 1811, 5 years before her father's death, not 2. She read it again to be sure. 1811. Her father had been borrowing against this house for 5 years before he died and had told nobody. The amount at that time had been manageable, but the interest rate embedded in the document, and she had to read the clause 3 times because the language was designed not to be immediately understood. The interest rate was not standard. It was not even close to standard. Mr. Greer, she said without looking up. Miss Whitmore. This interest clause. Can you explain it to me? A pause. It's quite standard. It compounds monthly, she said. Not annually, monthly. She looked up. Did my father understand that when he signed this? Greer's expression didn't move. "I imagine he read the document before signing." "My father was not a man who read the fine print," Clara said. "His solicitor would have, if his solicitor was present. I believe a solicitor was—" "I'd like to see that documentation as well," she said. Another pause. Longer this time. "It may take—" "We'll wait," Clara said again. Nathaniel hadn't said a word. He was sitting very still with his hands on his knees watching Greer, and the quality of his silence was the kind that made men nervous. Greer went into the back room again. "Monthly compounding," Nathaniel said quietly. "For 4 years." Clara did the arithmetic. "Without a single payment request. That's not an oversight. You don't forget to collect a debt that's compounding monthly. You forget to collect it if you want it to grow. Or if someone is paying you not to collect it," Clara said. She looked at the document again. There at the bottom, a clause she had nearly missed because it was written in the smallest possible type in language that was designed to look like boilerplate. She read it twice. "Nathaniel," she said. He leaned forward. She pointed to the clause. He read it. She watched his face. His expression went very, very still. The clause gave any third party who acquired the debt the right of first purchase on the underlying property in the event of default. At a set price. Determined at the time the debt was acquired. "He's already sold the debt," Clara said. "To someone who set the purchase price before the debt was activated," Nathaniel said. They looked at each other. "Harmon," Clara said. "Harmon," Nathaniel said. The door to the back room opened, and Greer returned, and he looked at their faces, and whatever he saw there told him that the conversation had just changed entirely. "Mr. Greer," Nathaniel said. He stood up. "I need the full record of correspondence between this firm and James Harmon. Every letter, every payment, every communication. I need it today." Greer opened his mouth. "I am a magistrate," Nathaniel said quietly. "And what I am looking at in these documents is fraud. You can cooperate with me voluntarily, or I can return tomorrow with the county sheriff and a court order, at which point cooperation becomes considerably less optional." He paused. "Your choice." The silence in the room was complete. Then Greer sat down heavily in his chair, and something in his carefully composed face came apart at the edges, and he said, "I'll get the files." Clara looked at the original document in her hands. At her father's signature at the bottom, written in the hurried hand of a man who had been proud and desperate and too ashamed to ask for help. She thought about 4 years of candlelight and account books and creditors and silence. She thought about her mother's voice breaking through the parlor wall. She thought about Isabella saying, "I want to fall in love with someone who wants to fall in love with me." And she thought about a man standing in the rain outside a flooding barn, handing her his jacket, following her lead without ego or hesitation. She set the document down carefully. Her hands were completely steady. "Let's see the files," she said. Greer brought the files in 3 separate stacks. He set them on the desk without looking at either of them, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how confident he was in what those files contained. A man with nothing to hide sets things down and waits. A man who knows what's coming sets them down and looks at the floor. She reached for the first stack. Nathaniel took the second. They worked in silence for 20 minutes, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that he didn't fill silence with reassurance. He just worked alongside her, moving through paper the way she did, efficiently and without performance. She found the first letter from Harmon in the 3rd folder. It was dated 14 months ago. 14 months. A year and 2 months before the debt demand arrived on their doorstep. James Harmon had written to this firm, inquiring about the status of the Whitmore mortgage. The letter was careful, the language of a man who knew how to be indirect, but the meaning was clear. He wanted to know what it would take to acquire the debt. The response 3 weeks later named a price. Clara set the letter down very deliberately. 14 months ago, she said. Nathaniel looked up from his stack. She passed the letter across. He read it. His jaw tightened in the way it did when something confirmed what he'd already calculated but wished he'd been wrong about. "He's been planning this for over a year," Clara said. "I wanted to know the timing," Nathaniel said. when the interest would reach the point where the Whitmore family couldn't possibly pay it back without outside help. He set the letter down. And then he positioned himself to be that outside help. The 30-day extension he offered you, that was never a genuine offer. It was a delay tactic. He needed 6 more weeks of interest. The particular coldness of it moved through Clara slowly. He sat across from me, she said again, the same way she'd said it in the carriage, the same words, the same flat tone, but with something harder underneath it now. He offered me tea. He told me he respected what I'd been doing for the family. She stopped. He said that he respected it. Clara. I thanked him, she said. I thanked James Harmon for being willing to work with me. The words sat there in the office that smelled of old paper and careful dishonesty. Nathaniel looked at her across the desk. None of this is your fault, he said. I know that. Do you? She met his eyes. I know it logically. It will take a while for the rest of me to catch up. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the files. Keep reading. She did. The picture that emerged over the next hour was meticulous and ugly. Harmon had acquired the debt 9 months ago, paid the firm a percentage above face value for the right to hold it, and written into the acquisition the specific purchase clause she'd found in the original documents. If the Whitmores defaulted, he had 60 days to purchase the property at a price that was below current market value by almost 30%. Below market. On land he'd spent 14 months engineering a crisis to obtain. This is fraud, Clara said. This is Nathaniel. This is legally. Yes, he said. It is. He was writing. He'd asked Greer for paper 20 minutes ago and had been taking notes in the methodical, precise hand of a man who was also a magistrate. It's fraud. It's predatory lending under the terms of the original mortgage agreement, and depending on what Greer can tell us about the solicitor who witnessed your father's signature. He looked at Greer. Greer had been sitting in the corner for the last hour with the expression of a man actively reassessing every decision that had brought him to this point. The solicitor, Nathaniel said. Was he employed by this firm or by the Whitmore family? A pause. By the firm, Greer said. Quietly, like a man who understood that what he was saying was also a confession. So the man whose job it was to protect my father's interests in this agreement was employed by the people who wrote it, Clara said. Greer said nothing. Was my father told that? She asked. Another silence. Mr. Greer, Nathaniel said. His voice was very quiet and very final. My patience has a limit. No, Greer said. He was not told. The room was completely still. Clara looked at the signature at the bottom of the original document. Her father's name, written in his hurried, proud hand on a document he hadn't understood, witnessed by a man who was supposed to protect him and didn't. She thought about what her mother had said. He hated for anyone to know when things were wrong. Thought about a man too proud to ask questions, too ashamed to admit he needed help signing something he should never have signed because he couldn't bring himself to say, I don't understand this. All right, she said. Her voice was steady, the kind of steady that comes from the other side of anger, not calm, but resolved. What happens now? Nathaniel finished his notes, set down the pen. Now, he said, we go to the county clerk's office. I file a formal complaint in my capacity as magistrate. This document, the correspondence with Harmon and Greer's testimony. He looked at Greer. Because you are going to provide testimony. It was not a question. Greer looked at him. The alternative, Nathaniel said, is that I return tomorrow with the sheriff and you explain to a courtroom why your firm's solicitor was not disclosed as a conflict of interest to a man who is now dead and cannot speak for himself. He paused. Your choice, Mr. Greer. The silence lasted 4 seconds. I'll testify, Greer said. They left Charlottesville at 4 in the afternoon with a formal complaint, filed a copy of every relevant document, and Greer's signed statement. Clara sat in the carriage and stared at the papers in her lap. She had been holding herself together with both hands all day through Greer's nervous eyes and the files and the ugly picture that emerged from them, and the cold realization that someone had been engineering her family's destruction for over a year. She had been precise and controlled and useful, which was what she did when things were bad, because being useful was the only way she knew how to fight back. Now the carriage was moving, and there was nothing left to do, and the day was catching up with her. She didn't cry. She was not going to cry in front of Nathaniel Caldwell in a carriage, and she was not going to cry alone later either, because she had made a policy decision about that years ago. But something in her chest was very tight and very hot, and she sat with it and tried to breathe evenly. "Clara." His voice was quiet. "I'm fine." "You don't have to be fine. I know." A pause. "I'm fine anyway." He didn't push. He didn't offer comfort in the way that most people offered comfort, reaching for it, reflexively filling the space, because silence was uncomfortable. He just sat with her in it, which was somehow both easier and harder than the alternative. After a while she said, "He was a good man, my father." "I believe that. He made very bad decisions. He was frightened and proud, and he made very bad decisions, and we've all been living inside those decisions for 4 years." She looked at the papers. "I've been angry at him. I don't talk about it because it feels—" She stopped. "He's gone. You can't be angry at someone who's gone and can't answer back." "You can," Nathaniel said simply. "You just can't resolve it." She looked at him. "That's—" She stopped again. "That's exactly right, actually. You've been carrying his decisions and his anger and your own grief simultaneously for 4 years, he said. While running an estate, while protecting your family, while telling everyone you were fine. I was fine. Clara." "I was managing," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there—" She thought about it honestly, the way she was starting to think it was possible to think honestly around this man. "Some days there is," she said. "Some days there isn't." Howe was quiet for a moment. Then, "What happens when this is over? When the debt is settled, and Harmon is dealt with, and your mother doesn't have to worry about creditors anymore? What do you want?" She looked at him. Nobody had asked her that. Not once in 4 years. Not her mother, not Isabella, not Mary. They had asked her what she thought, what she recommended, what she could fix. Nobody had asked what she wanted. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've been so busy keeping track of what everyone else needs that I haven't." She looked at her hands. "I think I'd like to sleep a full night. That's the first thing." "That's a start," he said. "I'd like to read something that isn't an account book. Also reasonable. I'd like—" She stopped, felt the thing she was about to say, and decided to say it anyway, because this man had earned honesty from her even when it cost something. "I'd like to not be invisible. I'd like to be in a room and have someone see me without needing something from me first." The carriage was very quiet. "I see you," Nathaniel said. "I have seen you since the magnolia shadow on the first day. I have not once needed something from you that you didn't freely offer." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "That's what I don't know what to do with." They arrived home after dark. Margaret was waiting in the parlor. She had been waiting for hours. Clara could tell by the precise quality of her posture, the particular arrangement of a woman who had been sitting in the same chair for too long and was trying not to show it. She stood when they came in. "What did you find?" she asked. Clara set the documents on the side table. She sat down. She looked at her mother and thought about how to say it, and then decided that her mother, whatever her failures, had earned the unvarnished truth. She told her everything. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. She sat very still and very straight and let Clara talk, and Clara watched her face move through the information. The second mortgage, the interest, the acquisition. Harmon's letters, the purchase clause Greer. When Clara finished, the room was silent. Then Margaret said very quietly, "James Harmon?" "Yes." "I've known James Harmon for 20 years. "I know. He came to your father's funeral." Her voice was controlled with great effort. "He came to the funeral, and he shook my hand, and he said how sorry he was. Mama, while holding a debt he'd bought to take this house." She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there with her back to them and her hands very still at her sides, while holding papers he'd bought. "Yes," Clara said. A long silence. "What happens to him?" Margaret asked. She didn't turn around. Nathaniel spoke for the first time since they'd entered. "If the complaint proceeds as I expect, he'll face fraud charges. At minimum, he loses the debt and the purchase option. Depending on the full extent of his dealings with Greer's firm, there may be additional consequences." "Good," Margaret said. It came out very clean and very cold. She turned around. Her eyes were dry. Clara had expected tears. There were no tears. There was something instead that Clara didn't often see in her mother's face, a clear, unperformed fury that was also somehow a kind of dignity. "What do we need to do?" Margaret asked. "Nothing tonight," Nathaniel said. "The complaint is filed. The documents are secured. We wait for the county clerk to process the filing and issue formal notice to Harmon. And the debt itself, I'm addressing it," he said. "Regardless of the fraud proceedings, the underlying debt needs to be cleared. I'll handle it tomorrow morning." Margaret looked at him. Then she looked at Clara. "He's going to handle it," she said, as if confirming something she needed to hear out loud. "Yes," Clara said. "And you're—" Margaret looked at her daughter, at the woman who had been holding her family together for 4 years in the dark. "You're going to let him." Clara held her mother's gaze. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to let him." Something moved across Margaret's face. Something that was not quite relief, and not quite guilt, and not quite pride, but contained elements of all three. She turned to Nathaniel. "I was not kind to you when you first came here," she said. "I treated you as a solution to a financial problem, which is exactly what I was hoping you'd be. And I was unkind to Clara in ways I can't undo, because I wanted you to look at Isabella instead of her." She paused. "That was wrong." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "you were doing what you believed you had to do to protect your family. I don't hold it against you." "You're more generous than I deserve." "Possibly," he said. There was something in his voice that was close to dry humor, and Margaret, to Clara's surprise, almost smiled. "Go home, Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said. "It's late. Come back tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He looked at Clara on his way to the door. One look steady and clear, and full of everything that had happened today and everything that was coming, and then he was gone. Margaret sat back down in her chair. Clara sat across from her. "He's a very serious man," Margaret said. "Yes." "I still preferred easy," she said. "For the record." "I know. But I was wrong about what I needed." She looked at Clara directly. "And I was wrong about what you deserved." Clara looked at her hands. "Thank you, Mama," she said, for the second time in 2 days. And this time it came out the right size. The notice reached James Harmon on Friday morning. Clara knew this because she was at the market when it happened, was standing at the grain merchant's booth when she heard the particular quality of silence that moved through a crowd when information arrived that everyone immediately understood was significant. She turned to find Thomas Hayes, who was Harmon's farm manager and one of the most visible men in Harrow County, standing 20 feet away with a paper in his hand, reading it and going very pale. She watched him read it twice. Then he looked up. He saw Clara. And in his expression in that single unguarded moment before he could arrange his face, she saw confirmation of everything she and Nathaniel had found in Charlottesville. He knew. He had known. Not the details, maybe, but enough. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to the grain merchant and finished her business. She was walking home when Eleanor Marsh appeared beside her. This was not, Clara thought, a coincidence. "Miss Whitmore," Eleanor said, falling into step with her, which Clara found extraordinary. Eleanor Marsh did not fall into step with people. Eleanor Marsh received people in her parlor and controlled the terms of every interaction. "Mrs. Marsh," Clara said. She did not stop walking. "I've heard some rather alarming news this morning," Eleanor said. "Have you? About a legal filing against James Harmon." It seems..." Eleanor paused, doing the calculation of how much to pretend she knew versus how much she was actually fishing for. It seems there were some irregularities in a debt arrangement involving your family. That's accurate, Clara said. And Mr. Caldwell is involved. He is. A pause. Clara. Eleanor's voice shifted, just slightly, not warmer. Eleanor Marsh didn't do warm, but something more direct. I want you to understand that the things I said, the things that were said around town about your situation with Mr. Caldwell. You were protecting social order as you understood it, Clara said. I know that. I wasn't. A pause. I wasn't being kind. No, Clara agreed pleasantly. You weren't. If what I'm hearing about Harmon is true. Another pause. If he was deliberately trying to take your family's property. He was, Clara said. We have the documentation. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. They walked. Then I was wrong, Eleanor said. About the appropriate target of concern in this situation. Clara looked at her. At this woman who had for 20 years defined the social reality of Harrow County with her careful strategic tongue. Who had just 3 weeks ago sat in Margaret's parlor and said Clara's reputation would not survive it. Mrs. Marsh, Clara said, my reputation has survived 4 years of holding my family together in circumstances most people chose not to look at directly. I think it will survive whatever you said about me. Eleanor looked at her, and Clara would remember this for a long time. Eleanor Marsh smiled, a real one, brief and a little rueful and completely unperformed. Yes, she said. I believe it will. She turned and walked away. Clara kept going. It was Isabella who found her in the barn that afternoon, which was notable because Isabella had now come to the barn twice in 1 month, which exceeded the total number of times she'd come in the previous 10 years. She came without muddy boots this time. She stood in the doorway and looked at Clara with those clear eyes. I heard about Harmon, she said. I assumed you would. Mama told me everything. She came in, sat on the grain barrel, which was apparently now an established thing. Clara, why didn't you tell me about the debt, about how bad it was? Clara looked at her. Because it was my job to fix it, she said. That's not an answer. That's your habit of carrying everything alone dressed up as an answer. Clara blinked. Isabella held her gaze. I've been watching you do this my entire life, Isabella said. You carry everything, and you tell nobody, and you fix it, and you don't let anyone help you, because you've decided that help is a debt you can't afford to owe. Her voice was quiet, but completely steady. I want you to know that I see it. I have always seen it. I just didn't know how to say so. Clara was very still. Isabella, I'm not finished. Isabella folded her hands in her lap. I want you to know that whatever happens with Mr. Caldwell, whatever you decide, I am not a debt you owe me. I am your sister. And I would very much like it if you stopped treating my welfare as a reason to deny yourself things. The barn was very quiet. I'm going to say something, Clara said carefully. Good. You have grown up considerably without my noticing. Isabella smiled. You were busy. That is, Clara stopped. Felt something in her chest crack open in a way that had nothing to do with pain. That's fair. Tell me about him, Isabella said. What? Tell me about Nathaniel. Not the practical things I know. The practical things Mama reports them constantly. Tell me about what it's like. Clara looked at her sister. She thought about 6 weeks of careful distance. About rain and account books, and a man who asked, "Are you saying yes?" in the middle of a burned-down plan, and waited like the answer actually mattered. Terrifying, she said honestly. Good terrifying or bad terrifying? I don't know yet, Clara said. Both, I think. Isabella nodded slowly, like this was the most important kind of answer. Then it's real, she said. The harvest fair arrived on a Thursday in the last week of summer. The whole county came. They always did. It was the kind of event that was officially about crops and commerce and community, but was actually about the particular collective human need to be in the same place and see what was true about the world and everyone in it. Clara dressed in her best dress, which was not extravagant, but was good deep blue, simply cut, the kind of dress that asked nothing of the eye, but rewarded attention. Mary had done her hair. Isabella had added a ribbon, and then at the last moment removed it, which Clara thought showed excellent judgment. She came down the stairs and found Nathaniel waiting in the hall. He looked at her, the way he always looked at her, which was directly and without qualification, and the particular ache of being seen without needing to perform anything had not gotten smaller with time. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Her mother appeared behind her. "You look lovely, Clara," Margaret said, in the voice she used when she meant something and was trying not to make it a moment. Clara met her eyes. "Thank you, Mama." They went out together, all four of them. Margaret and Isabella, just slightly ahead, Nathaniel and Clara, just slightly behind, which was not an arrangement that had been discussed, and was therefore, Clara thought, exactly right. The fairground was already full. She felt it immediately, the way a crowd with collective knowledge of something carries that knowledge, differently than a crowd that's just gathering. Eyes moved to them. Not unkindly, but attentively. The story had been circulating all week, the debt, the fraud, Harmon's legal situation, Nathaniel's role in uncovering it. The version moving through Harrow County now was considerably different from the version Eleanor Marsh had put out 3 weeks ago. Clara had not orchestrated that. She had simply walked through the market and answered questions honestly when people asked, and Nathaniel had done the same. And Mary, who was more connected to the fabric of the county than either of them, had talked to the people who talked to other people, because truth given the right channel moves faster than gossip. The first person to approach them was Robert Fielding, the mill owner, who shook Nathaniel's hand and then more deliberately turned to Clara and said, "Miss Whitmore, good to see you standing on solid ground." "Thank you, Mr. Fielding," she said. He walked on. Others followed. Not a parade, nothing that dramatic. Just the ordinary significant movement of a community, quietly revising its opinion and deciding to show that revision publicly. She was talking to the Harrington sisters about the autumn planting when she felt Nathaniel at her shoulder. "Harmon's not here," he said quietly. "I noticed. He's retained a solicitor in Richmond." "I heard." She looked at him sideways. "How do you feel about that?" Like a man who spent 2 days reading fraudulent financial documents, thoroughly unsurprised. He paused. "How do you feel?" She thought about it. "Like someone who has been waiting for something to stop being uncertain," she said. "And it hasn't entirely stopped yet, but it's less uncertain than it was." He turned to face her. Right there in the middle of the fairground, with half the county making various efforts not to appear to be watching. "Clara," he said, "I would like to ask you something." Her heart did the inconvenient thing. "Here," she said. "In front of—" "Yes," he said. "Here. Because I have done a significant amount of things quietly in rooms where nobody could see, and I think this particular thing should not be quiet." She looked at him. At this man who had arrived at her family's door looking for a practical arrangement, and had found her in the magnolia shadow, and kept looking, kept arriving, kept saying, "we," in the middle of every disaster, kept asking, "What do you want?" in a world that had never once asked her that. "All right," she said. Her voice was very steady. She was proud of it. "I want to marry you," he said, directly, without decoration, the same way he said everything. Not because it solves a problem, not because it makes practical sense, although it does. Because you are the most honest, capable, courageous person I have met in my life, and I have been a better man in the 2 months I have known you than I was in the 34 years before. He paused. And because when I imagine the next 40 years, the only version that makes any sense is the one where you're in it. The fairground was doing a very poor job of pretending to be about crops. Clara felt the eyes, felt the held breath of the crowd, felt her mother's presence somewhere behind her right shoulder and Isabella's slightly further left. She felt most of all the particular frightening, irreversible sensation of a door opening that had been closed so long she'd forgotten it was a door. "I don't know how to do this," she said, for the second time. The same words she'd said in the parlor weeks ago. "I know," he said, the same answer. "I'm going to keep doing the accounts," she said. "I expect nothing less. And I'm going to be wrong sometimes, about things. and I'm going to have trouble asking for help and—" "Clara," he said, and his voice was quiet and warm and entirely completely real. "Yes or no?" She looked at him. At the fair. At the county that had been watching her carry everything alone for 4 years, and was now watching her do something different. At her hands. The ink that was always there. The evidence of everything she'd been. "Yes," she said. Not a performance, not a surrender, not a transaction. Just a woman who had spent 4 years alone, choosing for the first time in a very long time not to be. Nathaniel Caldwell looked at her like she'd given him the world. Behind her, she heard Isabella make a sound that was suspiciously close to a sob, and she heard her mother say very quietly, "Oh, do compose yourself, darling," in a voice that was considerably less composed than the words. The fairground exhaled. Someone she would never find out who started clapping. And Clara Whitmore stood in the summer light with ink on her fingers and her best dress and 4 years of held breath. Finally leaving her body, and she thought, this is what solid ground feels like. She'd almost forgotten. The clapping faded the way. Summer sounds always faded gradually, naturally folding back into the ordinary noise of the fair. But something had shifted in the air around them. Clara could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky shows it. People didn't stop watching. They just watched differently now. She and Nathaniel stood together in the middle of the fairground, and for the first time in Clara's memory, being watched didn't feel like being assessed for what she lacked. It felt like being witnessed for what she was. She wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. "Are you all right?" Nathaniel asked. "I'm trying to decide," she said honestly. The corner of his mouth moved. "Take your time." "You said yes in the middle of a public fair," she said. "You could have warned me. You would have planned a response." "Yes. And then the response would have been organized rather than true," he said. "I preferred true." She looked at him sideways. "That is a very particular kind of strategy." "I've been told I'm a strategic man." "You have been told correctly." Isabella appeared at Clara's left elbow, which was becoming her established position, close enough to be present, far enough to give them room. Her eyes were bright, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was genuinely happy, the unguarded version that didn't come out for company. "Well," Isabella said. "Well," Clara agreed. "Mama is pretending she's looking at the apple displays," Isabella said. "She's been pretending for 4 minutes. She's seen 3 different women come congratulate her, and she accepted all of it, as if she planned this herself." "She may have planned this herself," Clara said. "She just didn't know she was planning it." Isabella laughed, real and uncalculated, and Clara felt the sound land somewhere warm in her chest. Then Mary appeared, which meant Mary had come to the fair specifically to witness this, which meant Mary had known what was going to happen, which meant Nathaniel had told Mary before he told Clara, and Clara filed that information away for future reference. Mary took one look at Clara's face and said, "Good," and walked back toward the food stalls. That was all. Just good. It was enough. The legal proceedings against James Harmon moved faster than Clara expected. Nathaniel had said the complaint was solid. Said it the day they filed it in the flat. Certain way he said things, he had already thoroughly analyzed, and he had been right. The county clerk processed the filing within a week. The circuit court judge assigned to the matter, had it emerged, been looking at Greer's firm for 18 months in connection with 2 other questionable debt arrangements in neighboring counties. Clara and Harmon's situation was not, it turned out, unique. It was simply the most recent and the most completely documented. She learned this from Nathaniel on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the fair, sitting across from him at her father's writing desk, with the papers between them and the window open, because the end of summer had finally relented enough to make the air bearable. "There are 3 other families," he said. 2 in Albemarle County, 1 in Culpeper. Similar structures, dormant debt, compounding interest acquisition by a connected party purchase clause buried in the original documents. He looked at her. "Greer's firm has been operating this way for at least 7 years. Clara looked at the papers. 7 years, she said. Your father wasn't there first. She took that in. The particular complicated feeling of knowing her father's bad decision had not been a singular failure, but part of a pattern that men with more resources and more strategy than her father had been building for years. "Does that make it better or worse?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Both, I think." She recognized those words. She had said them to Isabella about Nathaniel. "Both, I think." It was becoming the most accurate answer for the things that mattered. "What happens to the other families?" she asked. "That's what I want to talk to you about." She looked at him. "The evidence from your case, the Greer documentation, the Harmon correspondence, is the most complete record we have. If you're willing to allow it to be used in the broader proceedings, it would considerably strengthen the position of the other families." "Of course," she said immediately. He looked at her. "It will extend the proceedings," he said. "The case against Harmon personally may take longer to resolve if it becomes part of a larger inquiry." "I understand." "It means your family's legal situation stays uncertain for Nathaniel," she said. "There are other families losing their homes. Of course, we'll share the evidence." He held her gaze for a moment. "You didn't even need to think about it," he said. It wasn't a criticism. It was the voice of a man watching something confirm what he already knew. "No," she said. "I didn't." He picked up his pen and continued writing, and Clara looked at him across her father's desk. This man who had become part of her daily life so naturally that she had trouble remembering what the daily life had felt like before, and thought that there was something very right about him being on the other side of this desk. Something that felt like it had been a long time coming. The wedding was set for November. Margaret announced this with the particular energy of a woman who had been waiting for something to plan and was finally being allowed to plan it. She had opinions about every element, delivered them to Clara with efficient enthusiasm. And then, and this was new, this was the thing that was different now, stopped and said, "But what do you want?" Clara looked at her mother. "I want it to be small," she said. "The people who actually know us. No performance." Margaret considered this. "The Marsh family will expect an invitation," she said. "Eleanor Marsh can attend. I don't mind Eleanor. She was doing what she does." "The reception. Mary is cooking," Clara said. "That's not a negotiation." Margaret smiled. "Obviously." "And Isabella." Clara stopped. Margaret's expression shifted. "Isabella is fine." "Is she?" "She's—" Margaret paused. "She's finding her way. She told me last week that she's relieved, that she'd been afraid to say so." "Relieved," Clara repeated. "She said—" Margaret's voice was careful, holding something tender. "She said she couldn't have been what he needed, and that knowing that was going to someone who could be, she said it felt like being let off a hook she didn't know she was on." Clara sat with that. "She needs to meet someone who wants her," Clara said. "Not her face, her." "She will," Margaret said. And then more quietly, "You both deserved that, from the beginning. I just—" She stopped. She had been stopping at that particular place in the sentence for weeks, getting to "I just," and then running out of room. "Mama," Clara said. "I know. I should have." "I know," Clara said again. "We did what we could with what we had. That's all anyone does." Margaret pressed her lips together, nodded once, got up and went to consult Mary about reception menus, because that was what she did when emotion got too close to the surface. Clara sat alone at the writing desk. She pulled out the account books. Not because she needed to. The debts were being addressed. The estate was stable. The grinding arithmetic of survival had finally eased its grip on her, but because they were familiar. Because 4 years of habit didn't release itself overnight. She opened the most recent ledger and looked at the numbers. They were fine. They were actually fine. She stared at that for a long moment. The ordinary miracle of numbers that didn't need to be fought. Then she closed the book, pushed it to the side, and left it there. The letter from Albemarle County arrived on a Thursday. It was addressed to Clara directly. Not to Mrs. Whitmore. Not to the Whitmore estate. To Miss Clara Whitmore, Harrow County, Virginia. The handwriting on the outside was a woman's, careful, slightly formal. The hand of someone who didn't write many letters, but had thought about this one. Clara opened it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee. The woman's name was Ruth Easterly. She was 41 years old, a widow, and one of the three other families whose cases were being bundled with the Whitmore evidence in the circuit court proceedings. She had received word from the court clerk that it was the Whitmore documentation that had made the consolidated case possible. She wrote to say thank you. But that wasn't the part that stopped Clara. The part that stopped Clara was this: Ruth Easterly had also spent 4 years managing her late husband's estate alone. Had also spent 4 years doing what needed doing while society looked the other way. Had also, according to her letter, been told at various points that she was managing admirably, which she had eventually understood was the phrase people used when they wanted to acknowledge a difficult situation without actually offering to help. "I don't know you," Ruth wrote, "but I know what it costs to hold something together when you're the only one who understands the stakes. I wanted you to know that what you did, finding the evidence, pressing the case, gave 3 other families a chance to keep their homes. I thought you should hear that from someone it actually happened to." Clara read the letter twice. Then she set it down and sat very still for a minute, with her coffee going cold in her hands. Mary came in from the garden, looked at her face, looked at the letter. "Good news or complicated news?" Mary asked. "Complicated," Clara said. "The good kind." Mary poured herself a cup and sat down across from her. "Read it to me," she said. Clara did. When she finished, Mary was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Write her back." "I intended to. Today." "Mary. Today, Clara. Don't let that sit in a drawer." Mary picked up her cup. "She wrote to you because she needed to tell someone who would understand. You understand. Write her back today." Clara looked at the letter. "All right," she said. She wrote back that afternoon. 3 pages, which was more than she'd planned, but Ruth Easterly had said things that deserved 3 pages back. She wrote about the accounts by candlelight, about the arithmetic of survival, about the particular loneliness of being the person who knew the worst of the numbers and couldn't share that knowledge because sharing it would have frightened everyone around her. She wrote, "You said managing admirably." I know exactly what that phrase costs to hear. It costs something different than rudeness. It costs you the possibility of being helped, because everyone who says it feels they've acknowledged the situation and can now move on. She sealed the letter and gave it to Thomas to post. That evening, Nathaniel found it sitting on the hall table ready to go and asked who she was writing to. She told him about Ruth Easterly. He listened. Then he said, "How many families do you think there are, beyond the 3 in the consolidated case?" Clara looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Greer's firm has been operating for 7 years, in multiple counties, with a pattern that requires, as we have established a family in financial difficulty, a debt structured to compound invisibly, and a connected party positioned to acquire." He set down the cup he was holding. "How many times do you think that pattern repeated?" Clara was very still. "You think there are more," she said. "I think 3 is a low number." The circuit court. "The circuit court is handling the cases that were already documented," he said. "But if there are families who received demand letters and quietly settled, who didn't have someone to go to Charlottesville with them and read the files. They lost their property," Clara said, "or paid amounts they couldn't afford to avoid losing it." "Yes." She looked at the letter in Thomas's hand. "We need to find out," she said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "I think we do." She turned to look at him fully. "That's going to be a significant undertaking." "I know. It's going to require correspondence research, potentially travel to other counties, connections with other magistrates." "I know all of that." "And you're proposing." "I'm proposing," he said, "that we do it, you and I together, because you understand the financial structures and I understand the legal mechanisms, and between the 2 of us, we have exactly the skills this requires." He paused. "And because you just wrote 3 pages to a woman you've never met, because she needed someone who understood. You're going to spend the next year thinking about every other family like hers if we don't try." Clara looked at him. "You know me very well," she said. "For 2 months." "I know," he said. "It surprised me too." She almost smiled. "After the wedding," she said. "After the wedding," he agreed. The twist came on the last Sunday of October. 3 weeks before the ceremony, 12 days before they were scheduled to appear in the circuit court. For the formal proceedings, Clara received a visitor she had not expected. She was in the garden. Actually, in the garden, which was unusual. A concession to Isabella, who had pointed out with some firmness that Clara had not spent voluntary time outside in 4 years, when she heard the crunch of boots on the path and looked up to find James Harmon standing at the garden gate. She stood. He looked different than she remembered. Smaller, somehow. Not physically, he was the same broad-shouldered, well-dressed man he had always been. But something in the way he held himself had changed. The particular confidence of a man who believed he controlled his circumstances had gone out of him like air out of a bellows. He stopped at the gate. He didn't open it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Clara said nothing. "I'm not here to—" He stopped, started again. "My solicitor told me not to come. I want you to know that. I'm here against advice." "Then why are you here?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the ground between them the way a man looks at ground when the face across from him is too direct to hold. "Because I owe you something," he said. "And I couldn't." He stopped again. "I've done a lot of things I justified to myself because they were legal, or close enough to legal that I could make them seem reasonable." He looked up. "What I did to your family was not reasonable, and your father is gone, so I can't—" He pressed his lips together. "I can't make it right. I know that. But I came to say that I know what I did, and I'm not going to defend it." Clara looked at him, at the man who had sat across from her and poured tea, and said he respected what she'd been doing while holding papers designed to take everything. She had spent a lot of time being angry about that. The specific anger of someone who had been kind to a person who was actively working against them, which was a particular kind of wound. "Mr. Harmon," she said. He looked at her. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "I do, and I believe you mean it." She paused. "But the families in Albemarle County and Culpeper County deserve the same acknowledgement. And the proceedings next week will happen regardless of what you've said to me here." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop anything." "Then what are you asking?" A silence. "Nothing," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that I know." Clara held his gaze. "I know you know," she said. "I think you knew before you ever sent the first letter to Greer." He didn't answer. Which was, she thought, its own kind of answer. "Go home, Mr. Harmon," she said. Not unkindly. Not with the warmth of forgiveness. Either that was a longer road than one conversation at a garden gate. But with the steadiness of a woman who had made peace with what had happened without pretending it hadn't. He nodded once, turned, walked back down the path. She stood in the garden and watched him go. Then she heard the back door, and Nathaniel appeared, which meant he had seen Harmon's arrival and had waited, had trusted her to handle it, had stayed close in case she needed him, but not rushed in, and she thought that this was one of the things she was going to love most about this man for the rest of her life. "What did he want?" Nathaniel asked. "To say he was sorry," she said. "Are you all right?" She considered it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." He came and stood beside her where she was looking down the now empty path. "Do you believe him?" he asked. "I believe he means it now," she said. "Whether he would have meant it if the proceedings weren't happening, that I can't say." She turned to look at Nathaniel. "Does it matter?" "Not to the case," he said. "No," she agreed. "Not to the case." They stood together in the October garden that was going copper and gold at the edges, the way Virginia did in autumn, the way things beautiful in a different way than summer, quieter, more deliberate, the beauty of something that has lasted. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she agreed. He took her hand, quietly. The way he did things without announcement, without asking if it was acceptable because they were past the point of asking permission for things that had already been decided. She let him. She held on. The wedding was on a Saturday, small as she'd asked. The people who actually knew them, Mary at the back, Thomas beside her with his boots actually laced all the way up. For once the Fielding brothers and their wives, Eleanor Marsh with her careful eyes and something almost like genuine warmth, and Ruth Easterly, who had written back immediately after Clara's letter and had traveled 3 hours by carriage, and who Clara recognized the moment she walked in, because she had the particular look of a woman who had been the only person holding everything together for a long time and had recently cautiously allowed herself to set some of it down. They looked at each other when Ruth came through the door. These two women who had never met, and something passed between them that didn't require words. "Clara Whitmore," Ruth said. "Ruth Easterly," Clara said. They shook hands. It was, Clara thought, the beginning of something. Isabella stood beside Clara at the front of the room, in the dress she had chosen herself, not the one Margaret had suggested, but a simpler one, the color of autumn leaves that suited her better than all the carefully chosen things ever had. She stood there with her hands folded and her eyes bright, and at one point leaned close to Clara and whispered, "He's looking at you like you're the only person in the room." Clara didn't look at Nathaniel. "I know," she whispered back. "Is that strange?" Isabella asked. Clara thought about 4 years of invisibility. 4 years of being the person who kept everything running and received in return the acknowledgement of someone who gets a task done. 4 years of candles burning at 4 in the morning and numbers that told the truth even when the truth was hard. She thought about a man who looked at her in a magnolia shadow on a summer morning and didn't look away. "It was," she said. "It isn't anymore." Isabella squeezed her hand once. Hard. The way sisters did when they meant something they didn't have words for yet. Then the ceremony began. Nathaniel Caldwell spoke his vows in the same voice he always used, quiet and direct, and completely without performance. And Clara listened to every word, the way she listened to things that mattered, which was entirely and without the part of her brain that was usually calculating something else simultaneously. She spoke her own. She had written them herself, which had surprised Nathaniel and not surprised anyone else who knew her. She had rewritten them 3 times because the first 2 versions were too organized, and the third one was finally true. She said, "I have spent a long time being the person who holds things together in the dark, where nobody sees. You came and stood in the dark with me, not to rescue me from it, just to be there. I have spent a long time not knowing how to let someone do that. I'm still learning, but I want to spend the rest of my life learning it with you." The room was very quiet. Mary at the back was looking at the ceiling with great concentration. Margaret was not pretending to look anywhere else. Ruth Easterly had her hands pressed flat against her knees. Nathaniel looked at Clara the way he had always looked at her, directly, without qualification, with the complete and unperformed attention of a man who had decided she was worth his full presence and had never once wavered from that decision. "Yes," he said quietly, "to everything, to all of it." The Reverend finished, and then it was done. And Clara Whitmore, Clara Caldwell, now, though it would take her a few weeks to feel the new name settle naturally into her sense of herself, stood in the small warm room surrounded by the people who actually knew her, holding the hand of a man who had walked into her family's ruined estate, looking for a practical arrangement, and had found instead the person he'd been looking for without knowing he was looking. The afternoon light came through the windows, the way October light did, slanted and golden, in particular the kind that made ordinary things look significant. Outside the Whitmore estate, their estate now, formally the papers signed and the debts cleared and the second mortgage dissolved in the wreckage of Greer's legal trouble, sat in that light unchanged on the outside and completely different on the inside. The columns still stood. The magnolia trees were enormous and permanent. The east pasture gate had a new latch that Clara had installed herself on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks ago, because the old one had been wrong and she'd finally had time to fix it properly. Small things. Accumulated things. The evidence of a life that was now finally allowed to be lived rather than just sustained. Isabella found her after, when the reception had gone warm and the room was full of conversation, and Mary had outdone herself with the food, and Thomas had knocked over a chair trying to reach the apple tarts. "How do you feel?" Isabella asked. Clara considered the question the way she had learned slowly to consider questions that deserved a real answer. She felt the room around her, the warmth of it, the realness of it. The sound of Nathaniel's voice somewhere behind her, talking to the Fielding brothers about grain prices, which was the most ordinary conversation possible, and which she found inexplicably made something in her chest feel settled in a way it never quite had before. She felt Ruth Easterly across the room talking to Margaret of all people, and Margaret listening with the attentiveness she reserved for things she found genuinely interesting. She felt Isabella beside her, her sister, her complicated and beloved sister, who had let go of the hook and was finding out slowly what she wanted when nobody was deciding it for her. She felt 4 years of weight that was not entirely gone, but was for the first time distributed, shared, held between more than one pair of hands. "I feel like someone who has been running a very long race," Clara said, "and has finally been allowed to stop and look at where she is." "And where is she?" Isabella asked. Clara looked at the room, at all of it. "Home," she said. "She's home." And that was the truest thing she had said in a very long time. Not because the walls were the same, or the debts were settled, or the accounts finally balanced, but because home had never been a place. It had always been this being known, completely chosen deliberately, and allowed at last to stand in the light where everyone could see. Clara Whitmore had spent 4 years invisible. She would never be invisible again.